Hi, everybody in Fine Arts 104. It is me again, speaking to you live from my Corona bunker, aka my bedroom, and hence also the light shining directly on my very bright, shiny forehead. These are not the circumstances that we would have liked to carry on in, but it is the best we've got, and so we will do our best in these circumstances. So just on a general note, each week going forward, you'll have readings, a couple of them left in the textbook, but these last month and change of the semester, there's a fair amount of stuff that I'll have to find online just because our textbook is not one I picked, and it doesn't do the greatest job in the world filling in some of the stuff that I want us to cover towards the end of the semester here. And there's also um, going to be so just to mention that you'll have discussion boards about the stuff from the readings as well as screening responses to the movies that you can choose from that list that I posted on Brightspace. And those will be the discussion boards, and the screening responses will both be assignments. There's points that you'll get from both of them. And we'll probably do at least one more longer essay. I'm still trying to make my mind up what to do with the sequence analysis, which was going to be due right as classes were disrupted. It's a big project. I might turn it into extra credit. I might punt it a couple of weeks and still ask if people can get it done with more time getting used to things once again. If you haven't done it, don't worry about it. If you have done it, you'll get something for it. Just covering some of my bases here. But the thing I wanted to jump into right now is the topic for this week, and it's actually a bit of a shame that we didn't didn't get the timing right. I guess would be the way to say this, because cinematic style, our topic for this week, is something that I think is easier to pull out to understand with a little bit of back and forth, with a bit of discussion. So I do hope that you have a productive discussion about this topic on those boards that I've created on Brightspace, and I'll be online for those Zoom meetings, my office hours. And just to mention that really quickly, I'll try to make sure all of this is up to date on Brightspace. But I'll be online on Zoom from 2 to 3 on Mondays, from 2 to 2:30, and from 4 to 4:30 Tuesdays and Thursdays, and from 5:30 to 6:30 on Thursdays, which is when we would have met, of course. And so it's 4 hours a week where I will be on Zoom. And if you do want to have just a face-to-face discussion, great time to do it. It can be class-related questions, or it can just be discussion about class-related stuff, or it could even just be popping in for a moment to say hi, whatever you're comfortable with. All of that being said, cinematic style is something that is the culmination of all of those previous formal elements and formal techniques that we had talked about. So this is going all the way back to like week 2 of this semester. We started talking about film form, the way a story is presented is as essential to the experience of it as the actual content of the story, right? We talked about Moulin Rouge. And it would be easy to imagine a version of that story that is much more typical, if that makes sense. And Moulin Rouge is not. It's absolutely bananas. It's got the singing Italian guy in the moon. People, you remember the movie. That is a movie that has a very particular style, right? The formal choices that the filmmaker Baz Luhrmann makes are over the top. They are kinetic. They are attention grabbing. And I get the feeling, it seemed like a lot of you liked it, but I know from experience, Moulin Rouge is a movie that people tend to either love or hate because that style is so in your face that it doesn't leave much room in between. And I can tell you from personal experience, the other films by Baz Luhrmann, yeah, I'm not much of a fan of them. His Great Gatsby adaptation from several years back, hot garbage. But it worked for me in Moulin Rouge, and that's kind of the touchy thing with style. It is the culmination of a whole bunch of choices. And once you start making these choices, each choice, if you're a filmmaker, do we go big or small? Do we zoom in? Do we do a long shot? Do we muffle the sound? Do we use a filter on the camera? Do we move the camera? All of those formal choices we had talked about, they wind up culminating. Yeah, every film will be a million choices, and at the end of them, the hope is that you made choices that were effective for the story you were trying to tell, the impact you were trying to have, and that create a cohesive experience for the audience. That's the quote from the Coen brothers that I included in the discussion board prompt. This is out of the textbook as well. They said in an interview, at the point of making the movie, it's just about individual choices. You make a specific choice that you think is appropriate or compelling or interesting for that particular scene. Then at the end of the day, you put it all together and somebody looks at it, and if there's some consistency to it, they say, well, that's their style. And if you'll recall, the Coen brothers were the directors of The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. That movie, to me, it has a very particular style, notably because each segment, and remember there were 6 of them, has a very different look to it. And yet, I do think there is a coherency across the film as a whole. Each segment has a distinct look and a distinct style. The mise en scène that they settle on is quite distinct. I keep going to that word for each segment. But I don't find that there is a jarring difference as you watch the film. There are certainly some jumps, but you can tell it's coming from the same filmmakers. It's coming from the same mindset, if that makes sense. By contrast, if you compared the choices that were made in The Ballad of Buster Scruggs to the choices that were made in Citizen Kane, which we had watched, if I'm recalling it, just a week later. Obviously, these are movies made nearly 80 years apart, vastly different technologies, vastly different budgets, vastly different intents in a lot of ways. But you can still compare styles. Orson Welles, the director of Citizen Kane, he loved using that deep focus, that ability to get the far background, the middle distance, and the near ground into focus all at the same time, and then set up these compositions where there would be something like right up here in the foreground and something way back here, and your eye would just move between them depending on where the narrative action was. If you think, do the Coens ever do anything remotely like that in Buster Scruggs? Does Alfred Hitchcock ever do anything remotely like that in Rear Window? Did Olivia Wilde ever do anything remotely like that in Booksmart? I can't think of an example off the top of my head. And so that's what we talk about. That's what we mean when we say cinematic style. Each filmmaker, through the choices that they're making, are assembling a coherent vision, hopefully coherent, of the story they're trying to tell, the theme they're trying to underline, and the tone or the emotional tenor, or color you might use in sound studies, I believe, music studies, that they are trying to get the audience to walk away with. And so what I want you to think about, and this is one of the possible prompts for the discussion board, you can choose one or the other, is looking at the previous movies we've watched in class, and including the ones that are eligible for you to watch this week. What are the notable formal techniques that they use? If you choose to watch the movie I would have screened for you, The Grand Budapest Hotel, directed by Wes Anderson, what does he do with mise en scène, especially stuff like costume design and production design, which is like the set? What does he do with narrative? I think he's a brilliant screenwriter, both in terms of his narrative structure and in terms of his dialogue. And that is a very distinct thing compared to somebody who's, maybe some of the writing in Fantasia, for example, was not quite as structured as you might have liked. That's style. And so these are the comparisons that we can make. One filmmaker style to the next, one film style to the next. Not every filmmaker has a consistent vision across their entire career, and that's not necessarily a flaw. It's just a thing to note when you are analyzing film. Now, the other thing that you could potentially write about, and this is something I'd kind of alluded to a moment ago, is the limitations on style. Filmmakers might have big dreams, but they might not be able to fulfill them for a wide variety of reasons. Is the money there for it? Does the technology exist to pursue this style? Do they have creative control to the point that they can pursue their style? You can see this sometimes in films where there are hints that a filmmaker might want to be more expressive. They might want to make something that is not quite typical, but maybe somebody at the studio, maybe a producer was not a fan of that idea. It's possible. And I think part of it is also just you can see stylistic trends decade by decade or generation by generation. Even looking at the films we've watched in class, compare what would be a good example? Compare something like Rear Window, if you think back to that, to Citizen Kane. Those movies are made about 15 years apart from one another. There's a lot of similarities between the two of them, but not necessarily the exact same style, if that makes a certain amount of sense. And you can see that even in the more recent films as well. Compare something like Moulin Rouge to something like Stories We Tell. And Stories We Tell, obviously, is a documentary, but still, is the style even remotely similar between those two films that were created only a dozen years apart? Are we looking at a major stylistic shift from 2002 to 2013? These are interesting things to ponder. A lot of it is based on comparison, which is why, like I said, I was hoping for that back and forth, having this discussion in class. But you can have that discussion on Brightspace. And if you have any questions for me, discussion points that you want to raise, you'll be able to find me on Zoom at those times throughout the week. Okay. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy, and I will talk to you all again next week. Bye.